Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Han Da-eun in Seoul. Northeast Asia is seeing a brief lull from North Korea's missile provocations, but the two Koreas continue to walk a tightrope with recent series of events further ratcheting up tensions. After North Korea signed a defense agreement with Russia, South Korea and the U.S. signed a new nuclear deterrence guidelines, leading to the regular deployment of U.S. nuclear assets on the Korean Peninsula. The issue of North Korean defectors is also under the spotlight as a senior North Korean diplomat has recently defected to the South, while the Yoon administration for the first time for South Korean government designated July 14th as North Korean Defectors Day. All this as inter-Korean tensions mounted over anti-North Korea propaganda leaflets. Let's get a deep dive into these stories and more with our regular commentator, Dr. Ko Myung-hyun, who joined us in the studio. It's always great to have you with us.
Likewise.
We also have NK News podcast host Jacko Zwetsloot joining us via Zoom. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Hello to both of you, and thank you for having me on the show.
All right, Dr. Go, let's start off with you. President Yoon, marking the first North Korean Defectors Day, stressed that protecting North Korean defectors is our basic national duty and the first step towards addressing North Korea's human rights issues. What are your thoughts on the establishment of the day, and how would it impact inter-Korean relations?
It's all about establishing a moral high ground for South Korea, vis-a-vis North Korea. We have to read between the lines when it comes to understanding the latest move on the part of the South Korean government, which is elevating the status of defectors as well as their position in the South Korean society. We know that the North Koreans has recently claimed that unification is out of their long-term policy. They essentially claiming that two Koreas are separate entities now. So, and then they have actually walked back on decades of their policy statements and positions regarding unification. So Kim Jong-un has declared essentially that unification is not on the table anymore. So, and on the other hand, South Korea is taking the steps to declare that the North Korean defectors, at least the North Koreans who live in South Korea, who are defectors, are a whole part of the South Korean fabric of the South Korean society. And by extension, this implies that the North Koreans in North Korea also are South Korean citizens. So this is more about a declaration that the South Korea is essentially represents the Korean nation, and also it takes the moral responsibility for the well-being of the North Koreans in North Korea. So this creates the ground for the South Koreans to take a position, a moral position or a legal position regarding the human rights situation in North Korea. So in that sense, it's more of an intervention in the human rights situation in North Korea. And in fact, the South Korean government very cleverly is taking advantage of the faux pas that the Kim Jong-un has made by declaring that the South Korea and North Korea are separate, that they're essentially abandoning the moral high ground when it comes to unification. So I think it's a very interesting move, and also has a domestic impact. This is the date, the July 14th. In fact, it's a reference to the date that the law, there's a legislation that protects the North Korean refugees in South Korea was promulgated back in 1996. So it's as a background, it's a history, and reminds the South Korean government, South Korean society, that the South Korean government has been working on this issue for a very long time, and therefore this is a very important part of the South Korean identity. So I think it has many different meanings and has a multiple impact, and overall excellent move on the part of the Yoon Suk-yeol government.
North Korean defectors are South Korean citizens under the Constitution, right? And amid continuing reports of China's forceful repatriation of North Korean defectors, President Yoon has also vowed to spare no diplomatic efforts about the issue. But you expect limited. It wouldn't have that much impact on inter-Korean relations.
Because North Korea has declared that the South Korea is a separate entity, and their approach towards the North Korean defectors has always been very negative. They never try to co-opt the North Korean refugees in South Korea. It's always been very aggressive. They send assassins to go after the North Korean activists in South Korea. So there's no way there's no more space for North Koreans to make the situation worse. So in that sense, I think there's not much North Korea can do.
And Jacko, in related question, the designation of North Korean Defectors Day came as inter-Korean relations have hit a new low. How do you anticipate North Korea will react?
Yeah, I don't imagine that North Korea's leadership will like it. It has, over the years, called people who have left North Korea and who have spoken out against the conditions there. It's called them human trash and scum and other kinds of insulting names. So I imagine that if it says anything at all, it will make similar derogatory statements about them being traitors to the nation and so on. But I'd like to speak to the broader point that I think that rather than a day that focuses mainly on the 30,000 or so people who have fled North Korea and who now live in South Korea, I think that if you were to broaden it and make it not North Korean Defectors Day, but maybe National North Korean Human Rights Day, that could send a more inclusive message. After all, many people who are originally from North Korea and who were called by the state defectors or sometimes refugees or escapees or migrants, many of them simply want to get on with their new lives in South Korea and don't want to be labeled as something different from ordinary South Koreans for the rest of their lives.
And some experts also point out that North Korea is muted about it, presumably because the news itself could cause social unrest, and also because making a big fuss about North Korean defectors may agitate other North Korean people. Dr. Go, a senior North Korean diplomat, defected to South Korea from Cuba last November, which is just 3 months before Seoul and Havana formally formed diplomatic relations. What have you learned so far about this, and what do you make of it?
Well, North Korean diplomats has been defecting to South Korea for a while now. I mean, this is a part. The opportunities to escape from North Korea is higher. I mean, there are more opportunities for North Korean diplomats posted abroad. But what is interesting that the country from which the senior North Korean defector, his name is Leaflets, is defected from, it's Cuba. Cuba is a very central country for North Korea's foreign policy. It's one of the few countries in Latin America that North Korea maintains very good relations with. And also, it has been, Cuba and North Korea have been essentially very close partners and allies, especially in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they share this survival mentality after the socialist bloc disappeared from the face of the earth. And there's also military cooperation between the two countries. The famous example being the detaining of the Cheoncheongang cargo ship back in 2013 for violating UN sanctions regarding the transfer of weapon systems. In this case, the cargo ship was moving weapons, supposedly North Korean-made weapons that was exported to Cuba beforehand back to North Korea. So this shows how close the two countries are. But it's interesting that, first of all, that Cuba, which happened to be a very friendly country towards North Korea, normalized relations with South Korea. In the aftermath, a senior diplomat posted there has defected to the South. So I think this shows the crisis of foreign policy within North Korea. I think this could be seen as a fact that North Korea, having single-mindedly focused on developing nuclear weapons and relying on hard power to coerce the international community to accept North Korea's foreign policy goals, which in this case is North Korea being accepted as a nuclear state, has had important side effects. And this is probably represents deterioration of North Korea's existing relationship with countries other than, say, Russia and China. And even when it comes to China, North Korea's relationship with the very important country next door has been deteriorating very quickly in the last couple of months. So overall, I think the North Korean foreign policy is in crisis. And this is something that Mr. Lee has explained in the interviews recently, revealing that he's now in the South Korea. In the interviews, he said that many senior North Korean diplomats, such as Lee Young-oh and Han Da-eun, who happen to be the face piece of North Korean diplomacy in the 2000s and 2010s have been purged, and in the case of Han Da-eun, it's been executed publicly. So this kind of level of violence and purging that the regime is subjecting their diplomats to shows that North Korea's important capability of North Korean regime has either deteriorated or disappeared altogether. So in that sense, Lee Gyu's defection to South Korea might not indicate an imminent collapse of the regime itself, but at least it shows that a significant deterioration of the regime's capabilities.
And just to
Can I
add
jump
on...
in and add a detail?
Oh, sure. Go on.
Yeah, so according to an interview that I read with Mr. Lee Gyu, one of his tasks, one of his missions as diplomat in Cuba, excuse me, was to actively interfere with and block attempts by South Korea to normalize relations with Cuba. And I guess when he saw that that wasn't going to work, that could be one more reason that might prompt him to defect from North Korea and to not go back to Pyongyang.
Right. And just to add on to that as well, in his interview with Chosun Daily, he said that he defected because he could no longer tolerate the Kim Jong-un regime, which wasted hundreds of millions of dollars on nuclear and missile development while turning over 25 million North Koreans into modern-day slaves. So
exactly.
It looks like his defection will reveal more about the reality of the Kim Jong-un regime. Jacko, meanwhile, North Korea released photos of what's presumed to be anti-North Korea propaganda leaflets flown from South Korea. Kim Yo-jong warned South Korea will pay a very high price for their dirty play. Would we see another round of the North's trash balloon campaign?
It's certainly possible, but I can't predict whether they'll actually do this, because sometimes it's enough just to make the threats and to show that you have both the will and the capability. Now, similarly, South Korea recently set up mobile loudspeaker installations along the demilitarized zone and has threatened to counter any trashy balloon launches by blaring K-pop music and other information and messages that the North Korean government doesn't like, as far as it possibly can, into North Korean territory. Now, we know that the North Korean government doesn't like such activities because they previously threatened to shell similar loudspeakers when they were used in the past, about 8 years ago. So South Korea has tested these loudspeakers but hasn't started using them in earnest yet, and this may be again because the threat of using them is worth more strategically than actually turning them on. And I think that South Korea hopes that the North Korean government will be deterred from sending its dirty balloon gifts because the North Korean government doesn't want South Korea to turn on those loudspeakers in turn. So at the moment, both sides are threatening each other with things that the other side doesn't want. We certainly hope that it stays at that level and doesn't ramp up to some serious escalation. And as for Kim Yo-jong, she certainly makes a lot of these incendiary statements, but she may not know or may not care that the attention of much of the world is on other things right now, and that the balloons and the threats thereof are just not very high on people's agenda at the moment.
And reports trickled in just this afternoon that North Korea has also been planting thousands of more landmines along the northern side of the DMZ, which Seoul's defense ministry warned could flow into South Korea amid heavy downpours. But like you said, we're yet to find out what exactly the high price would be.
Yeah.
Dr. Go, the main opposition Democratic Party is reviewing to push for the banning of anti-North Korea leaflets, saying it's provoking North Korea's retaliation. It's not the first time this issue has emerged, right? Last year, the Constitutional Court struck down a law criminalizing flying of the leaflets, saying it's excessive restriction on free speech. What are your thoughts on the ban?
Well, one of the important problems with the anti-leaflet law was passed when the opposition party was in power in the previous administration of President Moon Jae-in was that it wasn't really banning only the leaflets or balloon that contains the leaflets, but also other mediums or media that could transfer information into North Korea, such as USB sticks. So it was a much more comprehensive law that prohibited activities that could allow the flow of outside information into North Korea. So in that sense, the crux of the criticism about the law was less about the leaflets, but more about the intention behind such a legislation that could didn't really quite, I mean, not just to ban the leaflets, which arguably could provoke North Korea to retaliate by, for instance, shelling the area from which the balloons were launched, but they also prohibited activities that has much more, I would say, subtle and clandestine that would allow activities from outside the country to insert external information into the country. So the opposition party's argument that the leaflets would provoke North Koreans to engage in violence against the South wasn't quite true, because they also prohibited other media, other types of information that mediums of information could be could help allow extra information to enter the country. So there was a criticism about this intention, that the intention of the party that passed this law was more about maintaining good relations with a dictatorial regime in North Korea, rather than protecting the South Korean territory or the lives in the South Korean side. So I think that this criticism still stands, and I think that this is the reason why the Constitutional Court has struck down this law. So we can, but then on the other hand, the Minju Party concern is not without merit. I mean, clearly, by singing the balloons in such a visible manner and a provocative manner, it does provoke North Koreans to retaliate. And then now we are seeing the trash balloons, and we don't know what next will come from the North Korean side. So there are spaces to somehow mitigate these kind of risks. But then criticizing the law will be out of place in this context, because the intention is much more broader that helps the North Korean regime to will allow the regime to keep its people uninformed about what's going on in the outside world.
The unification ministry...
I'd like to jump in for a second and say
sure.
that I
Sure,
think it's actually a real... I like the fact that we have this dynamic between the lawmakers and the Constitutional Court and then also the local governments in Pajo City. That this shows just a wonderful, lively and dynamic democracy that South Korea is, that it's not a dictatorship that a government can simply bam, make a rule, and that's it for all time. That there is this back and forth, these checks and balances, the Constitutional Court testing to see whether a law is constitutional. It's actually a positive way of looking at the situation. I think it's a good sign. It speaks well for South Korea's democracy.
The Unification Ministry just a few hours ago cautioned the main opposition Democratic Party's moves to push for the ban, so citing the Constitutional Court's decision last year. So we'll see how things pan out from here. And Jacko, top U.S. diplomat for North Korea issues, Jung Pak, has recently resigned, leaving the position vacant again amid rising North Korea threats. This came as concerns rose over Washington placing North Korea issues on the back burner for too long. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, it was certainly a very surprising move, but I don't want to speculate and try to get into the mind of Jung Pak. She left the State Department without, as far as I know, making a public statement. Before the interview today, I checked on her Twitter account and to see if there's anything there, but there's nothing yet publicly released. Now, there are, of course, a number of reasons why somebody might leave a senior government post, especially less than 1 year into that job. And one factor that might have pushed her was a dissatisfaction with President Biden's lack of success in actually talking to North Korea or achieving any significant advances. But of course, there could also be personal or professional reasons that we can only guess at. So, Jung Pak, if you are watching this, I do welcome you on the NK News podcast at any time for an extended interview to talk about this and other topics. But seriously, I think it's hard to say that North Korea issues are on the back burner completely in the United States, because North Korea is close to or adjacent to other issues like Russia, the Ukraine war, and China-US rivalry, and so on. So I think it's probably more in the forefront of people's minds in Washington than we think.
And presumably so, because there was an upgrade on South Korea-U.S. nuclear deterrence. Dr. Go, on the sidelines of the NATO summit, President Yoon and President Biden signed a new nuclear deterrence guidelines that will see more frequent deployment of U.S. nuclear assets on the Korean Peninsula. How do you interpret this? And would this provoke more provocation from North Korea?
Well, first of all, the more regular deployment of the U.S. nuclear assets to South Korea or the Korean Peninsula is just one facet of the new nuclear guidelines that was agreed between the two countries. So the central component here is the so-called conventional nuclear integration, or CNI. And in this case, the nuclear component will be represented or contributed by the United States. And the conventional side will be a joint effort between ROK and the United States. And the reason why the CNI is very important is because it reflects the possible realistic escalation scenario in the Korean Peninsula, where North Korea could employ conventional provocation to start some sort of a conflict against the South, which could easily escalate to a nuclear standoff. So, and this is a scenario that the South Korean and American war planners have been for a very long time concerned about. But then the social operational plans or the structure of the joint forces in South Korea and the United States didn't really reflect this conflict scenario at all. So finally, the United States and South Korea have agreed to essentially create a defensive posture that reflects the reality of the North Korea's nuclear threat. So, but it's going to have some complications down the road, because even though the United States and South Korea have agreed to have a conventional nuclear integration, but then the command structure, especially in the light of the potential return of the wartime operational control of the South Korean forces, this somehow has to reflect this new change. And it could mean that the return of the wartime operational control could take longer than we had estimated. So that's one downstream impact. Second is whether, also you said, whether this could provoke the North Koreans to increase tension in the Korean Peninsula. I doubt it, because what North Koreans are always watching out for is not, it's basically how strong the deterrence measures are against North Korea. And in this case, the deterrence means what kind of assets, nuclear assets such as submarines or attack fighters and bombers, and in line deployed against North Korea. And that quantity hasn't changed at all. So the amount of assets to defend South Korea against North Korea remains the same. So North Korea has no reason to complain about the new announcement about the joint nuclear guideline. But then what changes is the level of assurance lent by such a policy change for South Korea. So there is always concern on the South Korean side that the United States wasn't doing enough to assure the South Koreans that it will come to its aid in case of a contingency or North Korean threat. Now that element has been assuaged in a great degree. So in that sense, this is an improvement and assurance, less about deterrence, which remains the same. So North Koreans have no reason to complain.
And the final point of our discussion today, Jacko, North Korea held grand memorial events to mark the 30th anniversary of state founder Kim Il-sung's demise last week. Leader Kim Jong-un was also present in a move that's rather contrary to his recent efforts to accelerate his personality cult. What are you reading into this, and what other factors caught your attention?
Yes, North Korean criminology. It's always a tough topic, but I think that Kim Jong-un's presence at these commemorative events may actually help him to assume the mantle of his grandfather's legacy. Kim Jong-un has to do a delicate balancing act between, on the one hand, being his own man and doing his own thing, and maintaining the legacy and following the path established by his father and grandfather on the other hand. So I don't think that he can afford to cut himself off too quickly or too decisively from Kim Il-sung. This kind of softly and gradually approach is much more strategic. Now, we might imagine that the status of Kim Jong-un is rising slowly, while that of his father and grandfather is declining slowly, and they may pass each other at some point, but I don't think it's something that's going to be too dramatic. Other things that have caught my eye recently are the slow but limited rollout of a new badge that features only the face of Kim Jong-un rather than that of Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung. But not everybody is wearing that badge yet, and not all of the time. So again, I expect that to be a slow and gradual process too. And Kim Il-sung's birthday on April the 15th is now referred to apparently as just 415 rather than the Day of the Sun, which it used to be called. Now, that doesn't mean that Kim Il-sung's birthday is being ignored, but it no longer has the specially elevated status that it once did. And lastly, Kim Jong-un recently visited the embalmed bodies of his father and grandfather at the Munsusan Memorial Palace. And as long as those bodies remain there, embalmed, and the maintenance is done, as long as Koreans keep visiting them, even if Kim Jong-un doesn't go there too often, it's still a sign that the respect for Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il are still there. Now, the Rodong Shinmun published a front-page story stating that the best way to realize Kim Il-sung's lifelong desires is to, quote, dedicatedly follow the will of respected General Secretary Kim Jong-un. So that linkage between past and present leadership is still very, very much there.
It looks like Kim Jong-un will need a two-track approach, at least for the time being. Thank you so much, Jekko, for sharing your thoughts with us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Dr. Go, as always, for your perspectives.
Always my pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.